The missile hit at exactly 5:47 hours. Lieutenant Harper Collins was underneath F-35C tail number 307, her hands deep in the landing gear hydraulics, when the world exploded. The shockwave lifted her off the ground and slammed her against the jet's fuselage hard enough to crack two ribs she wouldn't discover until hours later. Before she could process what was happening, the second missile struck, this one hitting the fuel depot 300 yards away, with enough force to create a fireball that turned pre-dawn darkness into artificial daylight. Harper rolled out from under the F-35, her maintenance coveralls soaked with hydraulic fluid and now blood from a cut somewhere on her scalp. Her ears were ringing, but through the high-pitched whine she could hear screaming, alarms, and the distinctive sound of aircraft engines, the wrong kind of aircraft engines coming from the wrong direction. "Incoming! Multiple impacts!" The voice over the emergency frequency belonged to someone whose vocal cords were shredding from the effort of being heard over explosions. "This is not a drill. Base is under attack." Harper's combat training kicked in, the training that nobody at Naval Air Station Oceana knew she had, the training from a previous life that officially didn't exist in any personnel file accessible to base command. She processed the tactical situation with speed that came from experience most people assumed she didn't possess. Primary fuel depot, destroyed. That wasn't random. Someone wanted these jets grounded, which meant the next target would be either the backup fuel supply or the maintenance hangar disintegrated in a massive explosion that sent twisted metal spinning through the air like deadly shrapnel. Harper threw herself flat as debris rained down around her, feeling the heat wash over her back even from 200 yards away. Or the maintenance facilities. This was a coordinated strike designed to destroy the base's ability to launch fighters. She pulled herself up and saw them, 6 dark shapes against the dawn sky, flying in tight formation with the kind of precision that screamed professional military training. Even at 3 miles distance, Harper recognized the distinctive profile. Sukhoi Su, 57 Felons, Russia's 5th-generation stealth fighters that weren't supposed to be anywhere near American airspace. "Where's the combat air patrol?" Someone was screaming into a radio. "Where's our air defense?" Harper knew the answer before anyone said it. The cap had been intentionally scheduled light this morning. Budget constraints, training rotations, the usual bureaucratic reasons that looked criminally negligent when enemy fighters were actually attacking. There were supposed to be 4 F-35s airborne at all times. This morning there had been 2, and those 2 were currently 70 miles away, chasing what had probably been a deliberate decoy. "Get pilots to the ready room!" Senior Chief Jackson Torres was shouting, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Torres was the senior enlisted maintainer on the flight line, a 20-year veteran who'd seen combat in 3 different wars and wasn't easily rattled. The fact that his voice carried an edge of panic told Harper exactly how bad the situation was. "Ready room's gone, Chief." Petty Officer Ryan Mitchell appeared through the smoke, his uniform singed and his face showing the kind of shock that came from watching people die. "Direct hit. 7 pilots down. Medics are trying to—" His voice broke. "Chief, most of them aren't going to make it." Torres's face went white. Without pilots, the 12 F-35s sitting on the flight line fully armed and fueled were nothing but expensive targets, and the Su-57s were lining up for their attack runs, probably planning to strafe the grounded fighters and turn this flight line into a scrapyard. That's when Harper looked at F-35 tail number 307, the jet she'd literally just finished inspecting, fully fueled, fully armed with 6 AIM-120D AMRAAM missiles and 4 AEM-9X Sidewinder missiles, all systems green. She'd personally verified everything in the pre-flight inspection she'd completed minutes before the attack began. The jet was perfect, ready to fly. All it needed was a pilot. Harper made a decision that would either save the base or destroy her career, assuming she survived the next 10 minutes to have a career to destroy. She ripped off her maintenance coveralls. Underneath, she wore what she'd worn every day for the past 6 months, despite regulations that said she shouldn't. A flight suit. Old habits from her previous life, The life where she'd been Lieutenant Harper Collins, naval aviator with over 500 flight hours in FA, 18 Super Hornets, and F-35C Lightning IIs. The life that had ended 6 months ago when a combination of psychological evaluations, command decisions, and bureaucratic bullshit had gotten her grounded and reassigned to maintenance. The official reason was medical concerns regarding stress response and authority compliance. The real reason was that she'd questioned orders during a classified operation, been proven right, but made senior officers uncomfortable in the process. Harper had spent 6 months with a wrench in her hand instead of a stick, working on the most advanced fighters in the world, but forbidden from flying them. She'd told herself she'd accepted it. She'd told herself she'd moved on. She'd been lying. Collins, what the hell are you doing? Torres had spotted her sprinting toward the F-35, and his expression showed confusion rapidly transitioning to alarm. Getting this jet in the air. Harper grabbed the ladder and started climbing, her body remembering the movements even after 6 months away from the cockpit. "You're not a pilot. You're maintenance. Chief, check my classified personnel file." Harper was already in the cockpit, her hands moving through the startup sequence with the kind of automatic precision that you couldn't fake. "I've got over 500 hours in F-35s. I'm qualified on this aircraft, and I'm the only pilot on this flight line who isn't dead or unconscious." Torres stared at her for exactly 3 seconds, 1 second to process what she'd said, 1 second to look at her hands moving through the pre-flight with professional competence, and 1 second to watch another explosion send flames shooting 200 feet into the air as the fuel trucks detonated. The Su-57s were 2 miles out and closing. If they reached weapons range of the grounded F-35s, the entire fighter wing would be destroyed before backup could arrive from the other bases. "Tower, this is Torres!" The senior chief was already on his radio, making a call that would either get him commended or court-martialed. "F-35 tail number 307 is launching with Lieutenant Collins at the controls. She's qualified. It's in her classified file. We need her in the air now." Negative. The voice belonged to Captain Diana Morrison, the air boss, and it carried the kind of authority that came from 30 years of naval aviation experience. "Collins is not cleared for flight operations. She's been grounded for... She's either flying that jet, or we're watching 6 enemy fighters turn this entire flight line into burning wreckage." Torres cut her off, which was probably the first time in his career he'd interrupted a captain mid-sentence. "Your call, ma'am, but make it in the next 10 seconds or there won't be a base left to argue about." Harper didn't wait for permission. Her hands completed the startup sequence, and the Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder that she'd missed more than she'd ever admitted to anyone, including herself. The F-35 systems came online with familiar displays that felt like coming home after a long, painful exile. There was a pause that lasted maybe 5 heartbeats, an eternity when measured in the closing distance of enemy fighters. And then Captain Morrison's voice came through Harper's helmet, tight with the knowledge that she was approving something that violated multiple regulations. 307, you are cleared for immediate emergency takeoff." Morrison's voice carried layers of meaning, authorization, warning, and something that might have been understanding. "Proceed on heading 090, weapons free on hostile aircraft. And Collins, bring my fighter back in one piece or don't bring it back at all." "Tower, copy all," Harper replied, her hands already advancing the throttle. 307 is rolling." The F-35 surged forward with 43,000 pounds of thrust. Harper felt the familiar sensation of acceleration pressing her back into the ejection seat, felt the way the aircraft responded to her inputs like an extension of her own nervous system. This was what she'd been missing. Not just the flying, but the purpose, the sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. The jet lifted off after less than 800 feet of runway. Harper immediately transitioned to a combat climb, gaining both altitude and speed, while the F-35 sensor systems painted a tactical picture that was developing with terrifying speed. 6 Su-57 felons, now 90 seconds from weapons range of the grounded American fighters. They were flying in a tactical formation that suggested these weren't random attackers. This was a coordinated military strike by professional pilots who'd trained for exactly this kind of mission. The surprise attack, the precisely targeted opening strikes to disable response capabilities, the timing to catch the base at its most vulnerable moment. This was textbook. But textbooks didn't account for Harper Collins. 307 Tower, came Lieutenant Marcus Chen's voice from air traffic control. Chen was the morning watch officer, and Harper could hear the strain in his voice. Be advised, you are Winchester. You have full weapons load, but you are one fighter against 6 bandits. Recommend you establish defensive CAP and wait for backup. 2 F-35s inbound from Norfolk, ETA 7 minutes. Tower, negative, Harper replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd made similar decisions before, even if nobody at Oceana knew about them. In 7 minutes, those Su-57s will have completed their attack runs, and every fighter on our flight line will be destroyed. I'm engaging now. 307, be advised. Tower, I appreciate the concern, but I've got a firing solution and I'm taking the shot. 307, Fox 3 times 6. Harper's thumb pressed the launch authorization, and the F-35 shuddered as all 6 AIM-120D AMRAAM missiles dropped from the internal weapons bay in rapid sequence. The missiles ignited and streaked away at Mach 4, their active radar seekers locked on targets that had approximately 15 seconds to realize they'd gone from hunters to prey. The lead Su-57 pilot must have had excellent situational awareness because Harper saw him brake hard right immediately, deploying chaff while his wingman broke left in a textbook defensive split. The other 4 fighters scattered, their tight formation discipline dissolving as they realized they were under attack from a direction they hadn't anticipated. Harper's first missile struck the number 3 Su-57 before its pilot even processed that he was being engaged. The Russian fighter exploded in a fireball visible even in the growing daylight, debris tumbling toward the ocean 5 miles offshore. Her second missile hit the number 5 fighter as it attempted a defensive dive. Another explosion, another kill, another enemy pilot who'd probably never even seen the F-35 that killed him. Stealth technology at its finest. But the remaining 4 Su-57 pilots were good. They defeated Harper's other 4 missiles with a combination of hard maneuvering, electronic warfare jamming, and perfectly timed chaff deployment that confused the missile's radar seekers enough to cause them to miss or detonate early. 2 kills, 4 missiles expended, 4 very angry enemy fighters who now knew exactly where Harper was and were maneuvering to return the favor. 307 Tower, Captain Morrison's voice carried a tone Harper couldn't quite identify. Somewhere between impressed and terrified. Splash 2 confirmed, but you've got 4 bandits maneuvering to engage, and you're Winchester on long-range missiles. Recommend? Tower, with respect. If I break off now, those fighters complete their attack run on the base, Harper interrupted, already maneuvering the F-35 into a position where she could employ her 4 remaining AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles. I'm staying in the fight. She rolled the F-35 inverted and pulled through into a split S maneuver that traded altitude for speed and positioning. The jet responded with the kind of precision that justified its enormous price tag, sophisticated fly-by-wire controls compensating for maneuvers that would have torn the wings off older aircraft designs. Suddenly, Harper was diving toward 2 Su-57s that had been trying to flank her position. The Russian pilots saw her coming. It was impossible to miss a fighter jet diving at you from above, and they reacted with the kind of professional competence you'd expect from pilots selected for a deep penetration strike on American soil. But Harper had already achieved a firing position that the F-35's helmet-mounted display system confirmed with a solid tone that meant the missile was looking at exactly what she was looking at. 307, Fox 2! Harper called, launching an AIM-9X Sidewinder at the nearest Su-57. The missile came off the rail and immediately began tracking, its infrared seeker locked onto the hot exhaust of the Russian fighter's engines. The Su-57 pilot deployed flares, burning magnesium designed to confuse infrared-guided missiles, but the AIM-9X's advanced seeker had been specifically designed to defeat such countermeasures. It ignored the flares and struck the Su-57's left engine with devastating effect. Harper watched through her sensor displays as the Russian fighter began breaking apart, structural failure cascading as the damaged engine tore itself from the airframe. The pilot ejected at the last possible second, his parachute deploying just before his aircraft disintegrated completely. 3 kills. But the engagement was far from over. The remaining 3 Su-57s weren't running. They were fighting, and they were angry. Harper found herself in a swirling dogfight that would have looked insane to observers on the ground. Aircraft pulling 9G turns, deploying countermeasures, maneuvering for firing positions at speeds that exceeded the sound barrier. A missile lock warning screamed in Harper's helmet, the distinctive tone that meant someone had achieved a firing solution and she had seconds to live unless she did something immediately. She yanked the F-35 into a high G turn that pushed her body into the seat with crushing force, the G-suit inflating around her legs and abdomen to prevent blood from pooling away from her brain. She grunted through the anti-G straining maneuver, tensing her leg and stomach muscles to force blood back toward her head, while simultaneously deploying chaff and flares. The Russian missile, probably an R-77M air-to-air weapon, detonated 80 feet behind her. Close enough that shrapnel rattled against the F-35's armored skin with sounds like deadly hail. Close enough that warning lights lit up on Harper's display, showing minor damage to the tail section, but not close enough to cause critical systems failure. Harper reversed her turn with a violence that made the F-35's airframe groan in protest. She was bleeding energy fast. These kinds of maneuvers turned airspeed into altitude or turning radius, and you couldn't keep doing it forever without running out of the kinetic energy that kept you airborne. But she'd achieved something valuable. She'd reversed the engagement geometry and now had a firing position on the Su-57 that had just tried to kill her. 307 Fox 2. Another Sidewinder, another perfect track, another Russian fighter turning into an expanding fireball as the missile struck home. The pilot ejected, his parachute blossoming as he descended toward the Atlantic Ocean, where he'd be picked up by rescue helicopters and spend the rest of his career trying to explain how his supposedly stealthy fighter had been detected and destroyed by an American pilot he'd never even seen on radar. 4 kills. The remaining 2 Su-57 pilots made a command decision. They disengaged, lighting afterburners and accelerating away from the engagement area back toward international waters. Harper considered pursuit, but checked her fuel gauge and tactical situation. She was down to 2 Sidewinders and had burned significant fuel in the dogfight. Her F-35 had taken damage from shrapnel. Chasing 2 retreating fighters into international waters was a good way to either run out of fuel or escalate an already serious situation into something worse. 307 Tower, Morrison's voice came through, and now Harper could definitely identify the tone, respect mixed with disbelief. Hostile aircraft are withdrawing, vector back to base for landing, and Collins. That was the most impressive flying I've seen in 30 years of naval aviation. Tower, 307 copies, RTB, Harper replied, bringing the F-35 around in a gentle turn toward Oceana. Through her canopy, she could see the smoke rising from the base where fires were still burning from the initial attack. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights swarmed across the flight line, and she could see personnel working to move the undamaged fighters to protective revetments. The landing was textbook, despite Harper's hands shaking from combat adrenaline. She taxied to the flight line, where what looked like half the base had gathered. Seemed like everyone who wasn't actively fighting fires or treating wounded had turned out to watch the maintenance officer bring back the fighter she'd stolen during an enemy attack. Harper shut down the F-35 systems and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, letting her breathing return to normal and processing what had just happened. She just shot down 4 Russian fighters in her first combat engagement after being grounded for 6 months. She'd violated approximately 20 regulations by taking off without proper authorization. She'd probably started an international incident, and she'd do it again in a heartbeat because that's what the situation had required. She popped the canopy and climbed out to find Senior Chief Torres waiting at the base of the ladder, along with Captain Morrison and what appeared to be every officer on the base who was still conscious and mobile. Torres was grinning despite the blood that had dried on his face from his shrapnel wound. "Lieutenant Collins, that was either the bravest or the craziest thing I've ever seen a naval officer do. Possibly both." "Chief, I was just doing what needed to be done," Harper replied, standing at attention despite her body's protests. 2 cracked ribs, various contusions, and the mother of all adrenaline crashes competing to make her collapse right there on the tarmac. "At ease, Lieutenant," Captain Morrison said, and her expression was complex. Anger and relief and respect, all competing for dominance. "You just violated so many regulations that I literally don't know where to start with the paperwork. You took off without proper authorization, you engaged enemy aircraft without command approval, and you flew a combat mission while officially grounded from flight operations." "Yes, ma'am," Harper replied. "I accept full responsibility for my actions." "I'm not finished," Morrison continued. "You also saved this base from what would have been catastrophic damage. Those Su-57s would have destroyed every fighter on the ground if you hadn't gotten airborne. You shot down 4 enemy aircraft in a 6-to-1 engagement, and you did it in an aircraft you weren't supposed to be flying, wearing a flight suit you weren't supposed to have, using skills you allegedly didn't possess." Morrison paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened slightly. "Lieutenant Collins, someone made a serious mistake when they grounded you. Today you proved that mistake almost cost us everything. Effective immediately, your maintenance assignment is terminated, and you're reinstated to full flight status. You're going back to the fighter wing where you should have been all along." Harper felt something release in her chest, tension she'd been carrying for 6 months without fully acknowledging it. "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me yet. You're going to spend the next month in debriefings with people whose security clearances require security clearances. You're going to explain exactly why you were grounded, what happened during those classified operations nobody wants to talk about, and why we should trust you in a cockpit again despite your authority issues." "I understand, ma'am." The debriefings were exactly as unpleasant as promised. Harper spent days in windowless rooms with officers and intelligence analysts who wanted to know everything about the engagement, her tactical decisions, her weapons employment, her assessment of the Su-57's capabilities, and most importantly, how she'd managed to defeat 4 fighters that were supposed to be among the most advanced in the world. "The Su-57 is an excellent aircraft," Harper explained during one session. "But it's not as stealthy as advertised, and the pilots, while professional, made tactical errors. They committed to an attack profile and didn't adapt quickly when I engaged from an unexpected angle. Also, the F-35 sensor fusion gives me an information advantage that's hard to overstate. I knew where they were before they knew where I was." "And your decision to fire all 6 AMRAAMs simultaneously?" the interrogator asked. "That's not standard doctrine. Standard doctrine assumes you have multiple fighters and time to coordinate. I had neither. Overwhelming them immediately with multiple inbound missiles forced them to react defensively and broke up their formation. It created opportunities I could exploit. But the questions that caused the most argument weren't about tactics. They were about her psychological evaluations and the reasons she'd been grounded. Your previous evaluation noted persistent failure to follow orders in high-stress situations, one psychiatrist read from her file. Yet today, you disobeyed direct orders and stole a fighter jet. I didn't steal it, Harper corrected. I flew a combat mission in an aircraft I was qualified to operate during a situation where base defense required immediate action. That's a semantic distinction, Lieutenant. With respect, sir, it's the difference between theft and legitimate military operations. I was qualified on that aircraft. The situation required immediate response. I made a tactical decision that saved the base. By disobeying orders. By exercising tactical initiative in a fluid combat situation where waiting for proper authorization would have resulted in catastrophic failure. Harper met the psychiatrist's eyes. Sir, you can call it whatever you want, but those Su-57s would have destroyed every fighter on the ground if I'd waited for permission to do my job. The evaluations went on for weeks, but the conclusion was inevitable. Harper had proven herself in combat in a way that made her previous grounding look increasingly unjustifiable. 3 months after the attack, she was assigned to VFA 41, the Black Aces, one of the Navy's premier fighter squadrons. Her squadron mates were cautious at first. Word had spread about the maintenance officer who'd shot down 4 enemy fighters, but also about her authority issues and the classified incidents that had gotten her grounded in the first place. They watched her carefully during training flights, looking for signs of the problems that had ended her previous flying career. What they saw instead was a pilot who flew with precision and professionalism, who knew the F-35 systems better than most pilots, because she'd literally been taking them apart and putting them back together for 6 months. Her tactical awareness was exceptional, her weapons employment was textbook, and she had a gift for reading developing situations and making good decisions under pressure. You know what's funny? Her wingman, Lieutenant Jake Falcon Torres, no relation to Senior Chief Torres, said after a particularly challenging training mission. For someone with authority issues, you're the most by-the-book pilot I've ever flown with. That's because there's a difference between following stupid orders and following tactical doctrine, Harper replied. When the orders make sense and serve the mission, I follow them perfectly. When they don't, I speak up. That's what got me grounded. I questioned a stupid order during a classified op. Turned out I was right, but I made a senior officer look bad. And today, you saved a base by disobeying orders. Today I made a tactical decision during a fluid combat situation. There's a difference. Over the following months, Harper flew combat missions that weren't supposed to officially exist. Operations over contested territories where American fighters were not present, despite the fact that she was definitely there, definitely flying an F-35, and definitely engaging enemy aircraft when they threatened American interests. She added 4 more kills to her record over those months. 2 Chinese J-20 Mighty Dragons over the South China Sea during an operation that never happened, and 2 more Russian Su-57s over Eastern Europe during an engagement that officially didn't involve American forces. 8 total kills. It made her one of the most successful fighter pilots in the modern era, with a combat record that would have made her famous if any of it had been publicly acknowledged. But Harper wasn't in it for fame. She was in it because this was what she was built to do: fly fighters, defend American interests, and make the tactical decisions that needed to be made when situations went sideways, and command was too far away to approve every action. You know, Commander Sarah Vance, her squadron commander, said during one debrief, most pilots with your record would be giving interviews and writing books. Most of my missions are classified, ma'am, Harper replied. Hard to write a book about operations that officially didn't happen. Fair point. Vance studied her for a moment. You ever regret the path that got you here? The grounding, the maintenance assignment, all of it? Harper considered the question honestly. I regret the time I lost. 6 months when I should have been flying but wasn't. But the rest? She shook her head. I learned a lot working maintenance. I understand these jets in ways most pilots don't. And when the situation required it, I was ready to step up because I'd never really stopped being a fighter pilot. I was just temporarily assigned to a different job. That was Harper Collins in a nutshell. They'd tried to make her something she wasn't, a maintenance officer, someone who fixed jets instead of flying them. They'd grounded her for authority issues, when what she really had was the ability to recognize when orders were wrong and the courage to say so. Then, enemy fighters had attacked, and everyone discovered that you couldn't turn a fighter pilot into something else just by changing her job description. The instincts, the training, the fundamental nature of who she was that couldn't be filed away or reassigned. They thought she was ground crew, They saw the maintenance coveralls, the grease stains, the hydraulic fluid, and they assumed she was just someone who fixed jets. They had no idea that underneath those coveralls was a flight suit, and underneath that flight suit was a warrior who'd been temporarily misassigned but never actually stopped being what she was born to be. Harper proved that on the day she climbed into an F-35, while the base burned around her and made the choice to fight, despite being outnumbered, despite violating regulations, despite all the reasons she supposedly shouldn't. She proved it again over the following months, adding to a combat record that was classified but impressive, showing that she wasn't someone who'd gotten lucky once. She was a consistently exceptional pilot who belonged exactly where she was. 8 enemy jets eliminated. 4 Russian Su-57s, 2 Chinese J-20, and 2 more Su-57s. All in engagements where she'd been outnumbered and outgunned on paper, but had won through superior training, tactical awareness, and the kind of aggressive competence that defined the best fighter pilots in the world. They thought she was ground crew. They were wrong. She was always a fighter pilot. They'd just forgotten that for 6 months, and it took an enemy attack to remind everyone of the truth. Some people are born to fly. Some people are born to fight. Harper Collins was born to do both, and no amount of paperwork, psychological evaluations, or administrative reassignment could change that fundamental fact. She was exactly where she belonged, in a cockpit, flying fighters, defending American skies, and everyone who'd tried to make her something else had learned an expensive lesson about the difference between job titles and actual capability. The wolf doesn't stop being a wolf just because you put it in a cage, and the fighter pilot doesn't stop being a fighter pilot just because you take away her jet. Harper Collins proved that truth every single day. They thought she was ground crew. They learned otherwise, and the enemy fighters she eliminated learned it too late. 2 years after that morning when she'd climbed into F-35 tail, number 307, Harper stood in the hangar at Naval Air Station Oceana, watching a new group of maintenance personnel work on the fighters. She'd been promoted to lieutenant commander and was now the squadron's maintenance officer and a combat pilot, the first person in naval aviation to hold both positions simultaneously. A young petty officer approached nervously. "Ma'am, I heard you used to be maintenance before you flew combat. Is that true?" Harper smiled, remembering the hydraulic fluid and grease stains, the 6 months when everyone thought she was just a wrench turner. "It's true. I spent 6 months working on these jets before I got back in the cockpit." "Did it help, knowing how the systems work?" "More than you'd think," Harper replied. "Understanding what's happening mechanically makes you a better pilot. You know the limits, the capabilities, what the jet can really do versus what the manual says." She gestured toward the F-35s lined up on the flight line. "Every person who touches these aircraft, maintenance, ordnance, support crew, they're all part of the mission. But sometimes the person turning the wrench can also pull the trigger. Never assume you know someone's full capabilities just by looking at their current job." The petty officer nodded, processing this wisdom from someone who'd proven that job titles were just words on paper, but capability was what mattered when the bullets started flying. Harper walked out onto the flight line, looking at the jets that had become her life, maintaining them, flying them, fighting in them. She'd found her place, finally, doing both jobs and proving that the best fighter pilots understood their aircraft from the inside out. They'd thought she was just ground crew. She'd shown them she was so much more. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories every day.